November 1944. The tunnels beneath the University of Minnesota football stadium echo with the footsteps of 36 young men. They are not athletes. They carry no shoulder pads, no helmets. What they carry is something far heavier, a conviction so powerful they refused to fire a single bullet in war. Now they have volunteered for a different kind of battle. Outside these concrete walls, World War II is consuming the world. Bombs are falling on Dresden. Allied forces are pushing through France. And across Europe, millions of people, civilians, prisoners, refugees, are slowly wasting away from starvation. The question that haunts relief workers is terrifying in its simplicity. When the war ends, how do you feed a continent that has forgotten how to eat? Among these 36 men, there is Marshall Sutton, 26 years old, a Quaker from Indiana. His hands are calloused from months of labor in the civilian public service, planting trees and fighting forest fires as an alternative to carrying a rifle. But the quiet work has gnawed at him. He sees the newsreels. He reads the dispatches. He knows that boys his age are dying on beaches and in forests an ocean away. And here he is, in the safety of the American heartland, watching the world burn from a distance. When the brochure arrives at his CPS camp, he reads it twice. On the cover there are children with hollow eyes. The headline asks a simple question: will you starve that they be better fed? Marshall does not hesitate. He writes his name on the volunteer form that same night. He wants to feel something. He wants to put himself in danger. For the first time since refusing to fight, he feels like he might actually help end the suffering. The man waiting for Marshall and the others in Minneapolis is Dr. Ankle Keys, 40 years old, brilliant, impatient, and utterly consumed by a single obsession: understanding how the human body responds to hunger. Keys had already made a name for himself. During the early years of the war, he developed the K-ration, those compact emergency meals that fit in a soldier's pocket, and kept infantry units alive across North Africa and the Pacific. Now he is turning his attention to a different kind of battlefield. The intelligence reports flooding into Washington are clear. When the Allies liberate Europe, they will encounter an apocalypse of hunger. Concentration camp survivors, displaced families, entire nations whose agricultural systems have collapsed, and no one knows how to bring them back. Feed them too little, and they die. Feed them too much, and they might also die. Keys is determined to find the answer. His laboratory of physiological hygiene sits beneath the Memorial Stadium. The facility is a maze of examination rooms, kitchens, treadmills, and sleeping quarters, all hidden in the bowels of a structure built for football games. This is where science meets sacrifice. Keys has received permission from the War Department to recruit from the civilian public service, and the response overwhelms him. Over 400 young men volunteer to be starved, 400 men who refuse to carry weapons but are willing to let their bodies waste away for science. Keys and his team travel across the country, interviewing candidates at CPS camps, administering physical examinations and psychological tests. They are looking for a specific combination: physical fitness, mental stability, and, most importantly, the kind of moral conviction that will keep a man from cheating when his body screams for food. In the end, they select 36. The men who arrive at Minnesota that November are a cross-section of American conscience. 15 of them come from the historic peace churches, Mennonites, Quakers, Church of the Brethren, communities that have rejected violence for generations. But there are also Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, and one Jewish volunteer. There is Harold Blickenstaff, who grew up on a farm and can milk a cow before dawn. There is Max Kampelman, a law student from New York who will one day negotiate arms treaties with the Soviet Union. There is Sam Legg, quiet and steady, a man who speaks only when he has something important to say. Their ages range from 22 to 33. They are carpenters, teachers, seminarians, laborers. They have come from small towns in Kansas and industrial cities in Pennsylvania. They have nothing in common except a refusal to take human life and a willingness to offer their own bodies to science. The experiment begins with abundance. For the first 12 weeks, the men eat like kings, or at least like ordinary Americans. 3,200 calories a day, eggs for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, meat and vegetables for dinner. The food is carefully measured and recorded by Olaf Mikkelsen, the biochemist who runs the laboratory kitchen with the precision of a pharmacist filling prescriptions. The purpose of this control phase is simple: establish a baseline. The researchers need to know what these men look like when they are healthy, what they weigh, how fast their hearts beat, how efficiently their lungs process oxygen. Every day the volunteers walk on treadmills. They climb stairs. They fill out psychological questionnaires. Their blood is drawn. Their body fat is measured. They keep personal diaries recording their moods, their dreams, their hunger. For 3 months, the laboratory of physiological hygiene becomes their entire world. If you're watching this and finding the story compelling, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. It helps this channel continue telling the stories of history that deserve to be remembered. Now, let's return to Minneapolis, where everything is about to change. February 12, 1945. The semi-starvation phase begins. The men wake up that morning to discover that their world has been cut in half. Their daily ration has dropped from 3,200 calories to approximately 1,560. 2 meals a day. No snacks, no supplements. The food itself is deliberately monotonous, designed to mimic what famine victims in Europe are actually eating: potatoes, rutabagas, turnips, dark bread, watery cabbage soup, macaroni without cheese or meat. The meals are enormous in volume, but devastatingly low in nutrition. A man can fill his stomach with turnips and still wake up ravenous 3 hours later. This is not a diet. It is the systematic dismantling of the human body. The first week is bearable. The men joke about their growling stomachs. They compare their portions. They discuss recipes they will cook when this is all over. But by the second week, the jokes have stopped. Hunger is no longer an inconvenience. It is a presence, a shadow that follows them through the corridors of the stadium, that sits beside them in lectures, that whispers to them in their sleep. They begin to dream about food, not elaborate feasts, but simple things: a slice of white bread with butter, a glass of cold milk, an apple from a roadside stand. They dream about chewing, about the sensation of fullness they can no longer remember. Food becomes the only subject worth discussing. The psychological effects arrive faster than anyone anticipated. Josef Brozek, the lab's chief psychologist, begins to notice changes in the men's behavior. They become irritable. Small disagreements escalate into shouting matches. Men who were once sociable and outgoing withdraw into themselves. They stop attending the university classes they had been encouraged to take. They lose interest in letters from home. One by one, they surrender the things that once defined them: hobbies, friendships, intellectual curiosity, until only the hunger remains. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, administered throughout the experiment, reveals dramatic spikes in depression, hysteria, and hypochondriasis. These are not fragile men. These are the 36 most psychologically stable volunteers selected from over 400 applicants, and still the hunger breaks them. The physical transformation is equally startling. By the end of the 3rd month, the men are unrecognizable. Their ribs protrude through their skin. Their collarbones jut out like the handles of farm tools. Their eyes seem larger, not because they have grown, but because the flesh around them has receded. They shiver constantly. The laboratory is kept at a comfortable temperature, but the men complain of cold. Their bodies, desperate to conserve energy, have dialed down their internal thermostats. Basal metabolic rates plummet by 40%. Hearts that once beat 70 times a minute now struggle to reach 50. Some men develop edema, a grotesque swelling of the legs and ankles caused by fluid retention. They move slowly, carefully, like old men navigating icy sidewalks. Every step requires deliberation. Every flight of stairs becomes an expedition. The obsession with food intensifies in ways the researchers never anticipated. Men who never showed any interest in cooking begin collecting recipes. They clip advertisements for restaurants from newspapers. They read cookbooks the way other men read detective novels. For hours at a time, lingering over descriptions of roasts and pies and cream sauces they will never taste. During movie nights, organized by the lab staff, the volunteers pay no attention to the plot. Instead, they track every scene involving food. How many meals did the characters eat? Did anyone leave food on their plate? They become the harshest critics of cinematic waste. At mealtimes, the transformation is even more disturbing. These men, raised in families that valued courtesy and restraint, become territorial. They hunch over their plates like animals guarding a kill. Elbows go up. Eyes scan the room, watching for any movement toward their food. They develop elaborate rituals to extend the experience of eating. One man cuts his portion into dozens of tiny pieces, chewing each one 30 times before swallowing. Another dilutes his soup with water, stirring it endlessly, creating the illusion of volume. They lick their plates clean. They run their fingers along the edges of their bowls, searching for any residue they might have missed. Food is no longer nutrition, it is salvation, and there is never enough. The cruelty of the experiment is that it mimics reality. Keyes designed the protocol to replicate the conditions faced by European famine victims, not the acute starvation of concentration camps, but the chronic semi-starvation of civilians living under occupation. The men are not being starved to death. They are being starved to the edge of death and held there, week after week, month after month. Their bodies adapt. Their minds fragment. And all the while, the researchers take notes. Some men break. The diet is not enforced by locks and guards. The volunteers are free to leave the laboratory, to walk through Minneapolis, to pass restaurants and grocery stores and the kitchens of ordinary homes. The temptation is constant. 2 men are dismissed from the study for cheating, for stealing food, for eating outside the laboratory, for breaking the sacred covenant of the experiment. Another fails to meet the required weight loss and is excluded from the final data. But these failures are remarkably rare. 32 of the original 36 men complete the semi-starvation phase. They do not cheat because they believe in what they are doing. They believe that their suffering will save lives. They believe that every pound they lose will translate into knowledge that can feed a starving continent. The strain reveals itself in unexpected ways. Sexual desire vanishes almost entirely. Men who arrived at the laboratory with girlfriends and fiancés stop writing letters. They stop thinking about women altogether. The body, when forced to choose between reproduction and survival, chooses survival. Romance becomes an abstraction, a memory from a life they can no longer access. Even the drive to socialize diminishes. Men who once stayed up late playing cards or debating philosophy now retreat to their bunks immediately after dinner. Conversation requires energy they no longer have. Friendship becomes a luxury they cannot afford. The most dramatic incident occurs in the 5th month. Sam Legg has been struggling. The quiet, steady man who arrived in November has become someone else, anxious, withdrawn, plagued by thoughts he cannot control. One evening, while working with an axe, he loses 3 fingers. The official records are ambiguous. Was it an accident? Was it deliberate? Sam himself cannot say. The uncertainty haunts the researchers. Keyes must decide whether to keep Sam in the study or send him home. In the end, Sam stays. He insists on completing what he started. The injury becomes another data point, another piece of evidence that starvation does not merely shrink the body, it fractures the mind. July 28, 1945. The semi-starvation phase ends. The men have lost, on average, 25% of their body weight. Some have lost more. They are skeletal, exhausted, psychologically devastated. And now comes the question the entire experiment was designed to answer. How do you bring them back? The rehabilitation phase divides the survivors into groups. Each group receives a different caloric intake, some at 2,000 calories a day, others at 2,500, others at 3,000. Within these groups, the men are further subdivided based on protein and vitamin supplements. The researchers are testing every variable they can imagine. Does extra protein speed recovery? Do vitamins help? Is it simply a matter of calories? Or does the composition of the diet matter? The answers will determine how the Allies feed Europe. What the researchers discover is both simple and profound. Recovery is slow. The body does not rebound like a spring. It rebuilds itself brick by brick, and the process takes far longer than anyone expected. Men who receive modest caloric increases show minimal improvement. Their weight stagnates. Their depression persists. Their obsession with food intensifies. Only the men receiving the highest caloric intake, and those are still eating far less than an average American, show meaningful progress. The conclusion is unavoidable. Starving people need calories, and they need a lot of them. Vitamins help. Protein helps. But nothing substitutes for energy. The psychological effects, however, do not resolve so easily. The rehabilitation phase proves to be the most difficult period of the entire experiment, harder, in some ways, than the starvation itself. The men expected relief. They expected the hunger to fade, the energy to return, the fog to lift. Instead, they feel worse. Depression deepens. Irritability intensifies. Some men report that they were happier during starvation when at least they understood what was happening to them. Now they are eating more, gaining weight, and still they cannot escape the shadow. Their minds remain trapped in the tunnel even as their bodies emerge into the light. The final 8 weeks of the study offer unrestricted rehabilitation for a subset of participants. No limits on calories, no restrictions on food choices. The results are staggering. Men who had been carefully reintroduced to nutrition suddenly consume between 7,000 and 10,000 calories per day. They eat entire loaves of bread in a single sitting. They devour plates of eggs, stacks of pancakes, bowls of ice cream. Their bodies, deprived for so long, cannot recognize satiety. The signals that tell a normal person to stop eating have been scrambled. They eat until they are physically ill, then rest, then eat again. It takes months for their hunger to normalize. Some will struggle with their relationship to food for the rest of their lives. The war in Europe ends on May 8, 1945, halfway through the starvation phase. The timing creates a crisis. Keyes had designed the experiment to inform post-war relief efforts, but now those efforts are already underway. Refugees are flooding out of Eastern Europe. Concentration camp survivors are being liberated. And the data from Minnesota is still being collected, still being analyzed. The men in the laboratory worry that their sacrifice will arrive too late to matter. Keyes responds with characteristic urgency. He assembles a team to produce a 70-page pamphlet titled Men and Hunger, a Psychological Manual for Relief Workers. The booklet condenses the lessons learned in the laboratory into practical guidance for workers in the field. It explains the psychological effects of starvation, the depression, the irritability, the obsession with food, so that relief workers will not be shocked by the behavior of those they are trying to help. It emphasizes the importance of patience, the necessity of high caloric intake, and the danger of refeeding too quickly. The pamphlet is printed and distributed across Europe in the summer of 1945. It reaches workers in Germany, in Poland, in the Netherlands. It becomes a guide for an entire generation of humanitarian response. The full results of the Minnesota starvation experiment are published 5 years later, in 1950. The 2-volume work, titled The Biology of Human Starvation, runs to 1,385 pages. It contains 50 chapters analyzing every aspect of the physiological and psychological data collected during the study. It reviews the existing literature on famine. It proposes rehabilitation protocols. It becomes an instant classic, the definitive scientific text on human starvation. 75 years later, it remains essential reading for nutritionists, psychologists, and relief workers. No comparable study has ever been conducted. No comparable study ever will be. The ethical standards that govern human research today would never permit 36 healthy men to voluntarily waste away for science. The men who survived the Minnesota experiment carry its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. Some enter relief work traveling to Europe and Asia to apply directly what they learned in that basement laboratory. Others become ministers, teachers, scholars. Max Campbellman goes on to become an ambassador and arms control negotiator under multiple presidents. 3 of the volunteers, their obsession with food unbroken, become professional chefs. 1 enters agriculture. They reunite periodically. These 36 men who shared something that no one else can fully understand. They speak of the experience with a mixture of pride and trauma. They starved so that others might be better fed. And for the rest of their lives, they remember what it feels like to be truly hungry. The Minnesota starvation experiment also transformed our understanding of eating disorders. Decades later, researchers studying anorexia nervosa recognized the symptoms described by Keyes and his team: the obsession with food, the hoarding behavior, the ritual cutting of meals into tiny pieces, the distorted body image, the depression, and social withdrawal. The Minnesota data demonstrated that these symptoms are not merely psychological, they are biological responses to starvation. When the brain lacks fuel, it rewires itself around the search for food. This insight has shaped eating disorder treatment ever since. Clinicians now understand that psychological therapy alone is insufficient. Patients must first be physically renourished before their minds can heal. The 36 conscientious objectors in that basement laboratory, without knowing it, provided the foundation for modern anorexia treatment. Ancel Keys continued his research for another half-century. He pioneered the study of the Mediterranean diet, spending decades investigating why populations in Italy and Greece experienced lower rates of heart disease. He popularized the body mass index as a measure of healthy weight. In 1961, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. He lived to be 100 years old, dying in 2004 in his home in Naples, Italy. A testament, perhaps, to the dietary principles he spent his life advocating. Joseph Brozek, the psychologist who documented the mental deterioration of the volunteers, went on to become a distinguished historian of psychology at Lehigh University. The Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene, founded by Keyes in that football stadium basement, continued to produce groundbreaking research for decades. What remains of the Minnesota starvation experiment today is a reminder of what happens when war destroys not just cities, but food systems. A reminder of the profound connection between body and mind, how hunger does not merely weaken muscles, but rewires thoughts, emotions, relationships, and a reminder of what human beings are capable of when they believe in something larger than themselves. 36 men who refused to kill chose instead to suffer. They walked into that laboratory in November 1944 as idealists looking for meaning. They emerged a year later as data points, as the evidence that would feed millions. The images from July 1945 tell the story better than any words. Life magazine published photographs of the volunteers, shirtless, their bones visible through translucent skin. They looked like the prisoners they were trying to help. They looked like the refugees flooding out of Europe. They looked like men who have been to war, even though they never touched a weapon. Their eyes carry something that photographs cannot fully capture, a knowledge of what the body can endure and what it costs the soul. The question on that recruitment brochure "Will you starve that they be better fed?" was answered by 36 men in Minneapolis. But the question itself persists. It echoes through every famine, every refugee crisis, every humanitarian disaster. It asks what we are willing to sacrifice for strangers. It asks whether knowledge gained through suffering can be justified by lives saved. It asks whether conscience is a form of courage or simply a different kind of duty. In the end, the Minnesota starvation experiment is not just a story about science. It is a story about belief, about men who believed so deeply in the sanctity of human life that they refused to take it, and then offered their own bodies as proof of their conviction. They believed that their suffering would matter. And for millions of people in post-war Europe and Asia, for countless patients recovering from eating disorders, for every relief worker who has ever confronted the hollow eyes of famine, it did. The 36 men in that basement laboratory wrote an answer with their bones, and the world has been reading it ever since. The legacy of the experiment extends far beyond the scientific literature. It fundamentally changed how humanitarian organizations approach famine relief. Before Minnesota, refeeding was often improvised, well-meaning workers offering whatever food was available without understanding the dangers. Keyes and his team demonstrated that rehabilitation must be gradual, carefully calibrated, and sustained over months rather than weeks. They identified what we now call refeeding syndrome, the potentially fatal metabolic complications that occur when a starving body receives too much nutrition too quickly. Their protocols saved lives, not just in 1945, but in every subsequent famine response, from the Ethiopian crisis of the 1980s to the Syrian refugee emergency of the 2010s. The volunteers themselves became living testimony to the experiment's findings. Marshall Sutton, the young Quaker who wanted to feel danger, spent the rest of his life speaking about his experience. In interviews conducted decades later, he described the hunger with a precision that only those who have truly suffered can achieve. He spoke of the physical sensation, the gnawing, the cramping, the relentless emptiness that no amount of water could fill. He spoke of the psychological dimension, how food became everything, how relationships faded, how his world contracted until nothing existed except the next meal. And he spoke of the purpose that sustained him through 6 months of agony, the belief that his suffering would translate into salvation for others. The data from Minnesota revealed something profound about human resilience and its limits. The body adapts to starvation in ways that are both ingenious and devastating. Heart rate slows to conserve energy, temperature drops, metabolism decreases. The body begins to consume itself, first fat, then muscle, then the very tissues that keep organs functioning. But the mind adapts too in ways that are harder to measure and longer to heal. The volunteers' psychological recovery lagged far behind their physical recovery. Months after returning to normal eating, they still hoarded food. They still felt hungry even after large meals. They still struggled with depression and social withdrawal. The researchers concluded that rehabilitation from starvation requires more than calories. It requires time, patience, and an understanding that invisible wounds take longest to heal. The ethical questions raised by the Minnesota experiment have never been fully resolved. By modern standards, the study would be unthinkable. No institutional review board would approve a protocol that deliberately starves healthy subjects for 6 months. No informed consent process could adequately prepare a volunteer for the psychological devastation that awaits. Yet the knowledge gained from the experiment has saved countless lives. The men who participated believed they were doing the right thing. They signed consent forms. They understood the risks. They chose suffering over violence. Was it ethical to let them make that choice? Was it ethical to benefit from their sacrifice? These questions haunt the history of human experimentation, and the Minnesota starvation experiment sits at the center of that haunting. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the experiment is how completely it has been forgotten. Few people outside specialized academic circles have heard of the Minnesota starvation experiment. The names of the 36 volunteers are not taught in schools. Their sacrifice exists in footnotes and bibliography entries, in the dusty stacks of university libraries, in the memories of the few survivors who remain. Yet their contribution to human welfare exceeds that of many celebrated heroes. They proved that ordinary men, driven by conscience rather than glory, can endure extraordinary suffering for the benefit of strangers. They demonstrated that science, conducted with rigor and compassion, can transform understanding into action. They showed that the deepest form of courage is not the willingness to kill, but the willingness to suffer. The corridors beneath the University of Minnesota football stadium are quiet now. The Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene has been replaced by newer facilities, more modern equipment, different research priorities. But if you walk through those tunnels, you are walking through history. You are walking where 36 men once shuffled on weakened legs, where they lined up for their meager portions of turnip soup, where they lay awake at night, dreaming of bread and butter. You are walking through the place where humanity learned how to feed itself after war. The ghosts of that laboratory are not malevolent. They are simply hungry, forever hungry, and their hunger saved the world. The Minnesota starvation experiment ended on December 20, 1945. The men packed their bags, said goodbye to the researchers who had measured their decline and monitored their recovery, and stepped back into a world that had changed completely during their year underground. The war was over. The atomic age had begun. The United Nations was being founded. And somewhere in Europe, in a displaced persons camp, or a hospital ward, or a ruined farmhouse, a relief worker was consulting a 70-page pamphlet and learning how to bring the dead back to life. The knowledge had arrived. The sacrifice had been worth it. 36 men who refused to fight had won their own kind of victory.